All right, so you ready to like really get into the cocaine trade? We're going deep on this one. We've got a bunch of sources lined up, YouTube videos, documentaries, even some academic stuff.
Yeah, it's a bit of a wild mix, but that's how we roll on these deep dives. You never know what you're going to find.
Right. It's going to be a trip for sure. So we've got these YouTube videos that are taking us like right inside these smuggling operations. It's crazy.
And documentaries tracing cocaine's journey. I mean, literally from coca fields all the way to, yeah, well closer to home than you might think.
And then to make things even more interesting, we found this academic presentation that breaks down the economics of it all. Like, how does this whole industry actually function?
It's fascinating, I have to say. You know, on the one hand, you have this image of cocaine as like this glamorous party drug.
Oh, yeah, sure.
But these sources, they really revealed the dark side of that image, the violence, the exploitation, and, you know, the environmental damage. It's all connected to this multi-billion-dollar industry.
It's heavy stuff. And, you know, it's easy to think of this as like a problem over there, you know, somewhere in the jungles of South America. But the UK is Europe's biggest consumer of cocaine. So this is a problem that touches all of us, whether we realize it or not.
Exactly. The choices we make here in the UK, they have ripple effects across the globe. And as we'll see, those ripples can turn into like tidal waves of suffering.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought for sure. So let's start at the beginning, the heart of it all. The Andean region of South America, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia.
These countries are basically synonymous with cocaine production.
Right. And our sources, they painted a pretty vivid picture of what life is like for people there, especially the coca farmers.
It's a life that's often defined by desperation. Like this one documentary, From the Jungle to the Street, it introduced us to this coca farmer named Pedro. He literally risks his life every day.
Really?
Yeah. He uses gasoline and battery acid in this like makeshift jungle lab to produce cocaine paste.
Wow.
Yes?
Just to survive.
It's the only way he knows how to support his family.
That's intense. It's like that image of him mixing those chemicals with his bare feet just to make ends meet. It's hard to forget.
It really highlights those complex economic forces at play.
Yeah, for sure. And Colombia has been like the kingpin of coca production for a long time. But we learned from that academic presentation that Peru is stepping up its game. Big time.
And that shift in production has some serious implications. Because Peru's rise, it's empowered these Mexican cartels, like the Sinaloa cartel.
Oh, wow.
It gives them more control over the supply chain. And it could lead to even more violence as they fight for dominance. It's a reminder that what might seem like this local issue, you know, way over there in the Andes, it actually has far-reaching consequences, including right here in the UK.
So, like, what kind of consequences are we talking about?
Imagine the impact on prices and availability if one cartel suddenly controls a much bigger chunk of the supply.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. And speaking of cartels, that YouTube deep dive on Clan del Golfo was chilling. They're brutal.
They're organized, too. I mean, their level of sophistication is terrifying.
It's like they're not just thugs. They're running a corporation or something.
It's crazy. They have clandestine airfields, corrupt officials on their payroll. They even have private military companies working for them.
It's mind-boggling. And then you think about the human cost. Over 260,000 Colombians have been killed in the past 6 decades because of this trade.
That's not just a statistic. That's families torn apart, communities living in fear. It's a war zone, and our demand is fueling it.
It's easy to forget that when you're just thinking about, you know, a line of Coke on a Saturday night.
And remember Liz, the woman from the documentary who lost her business.
Yeah.
She was displaced by the cartel, and now she lives in this dilapidated hostel that's controlled by them. Her story, it's heartbreaking. It really shows you how the cocaine trade just destroys lives, and it leaves innocent people caught in the crossfire.
Yeah, it's like this cancer that spreads and impacts every level of society.
Exactly. And as we dig deeper into the smuggling routes, you'll see how that cancer has spread across the globe.
Okay, so we've got this like incredibly powerful and dangerous cartel, right?
Yeah.
And this like growing demand for cocaine here in the UK. So I'm guessing smuggling operations are getting pretty sophisticated too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The documentaries, they really highlighted how creative these smugglers can be. We're talking speedboats zipping across the Caribbean, cocaine stashed in shipping containers. They even like weld packages to the bottom of cargo ships. It's wild.
I mean, we saw how Clan del Golfo operates, right? They're not just relying on brute force. It's like they're playing chess, always one step ahead.
Yeah.
And then there was that crazy journey up the Magdalena River The constant threat from rival gangs and authorities, it felt like something out of a movie.
It is high stakes, absolutely. But what's really striking is how these smuggling routes have evolved. It used to be all about the Caribbean. But then, as Mexican cartels gained power, the focus shifted towards the U.S.-Mexico border. It's this constant cat-and-mouse game with law enforcement agencies.
Like who?
Well, you've got the Colombian Navy, the UK's National Crime Agency. They're all trying to stay one step ahead, but it's tough.
It really highlights the global scale of this whole operation.
Yeah.
But let's bring it back home for a second. We know the UK is the biggest consumer of cocaine in Europe, but what does that actually look like, on the ground?
Well, one thing that really stood out in the sources was the rise in purity levels. It's alarming. The average purity of cocaine on UK streets has skyrocketed, and that's linked to lower prices and, unfortunately, an increased risk of addiction and overdose.
And, access is easier than ever.
Yeah.
They showed how you can just send a quick text message and have cocaine delivered right to your doorstep, faster than ordering a pizza. It's crazy.
And it's that ease of access coupled with the normalization of cocaine use, especially among young people. That's really worrying. The documentary showed how it's become almost commonplace in nightlife, social settings.
Yeah. They interviewed a dealer operating out of a trap house in South London. It was shocking how casual he was about it, just weighing out grams of cocaine like it was just another day at the office.
And that's part of the problem. It desensitizes us to the brutal realities behind this trade. We forget that every gram of cocaine represents a trail of violence, exploitation, environmental destruction. This isn't just a harmless party drug. It's fueling a global crisis.
Yeah, and that crisis has a very human face. Will's story from the jungle to the street was so powerful. He went from a successful career, loving family, to living on the streets. Because of his addiction, he literally said, "I'm lucky to be alive."
His story is a stark reminder that addiction can touch anyone, regardless of your background or social status. And it's not just the individual who suffers, it's their families, their friends, their communities. The ripple effects are huge.
We've talked about the human cost, but the documentaries also didn't shy away from the environmental impact. Those images of pristine rainforest landscapes being destroyed for coca cultivation. It's heartbreaking.
And the damage goes beyond deforestation. Remember Pedro's makeshift lab? With the gasoline and battery acid, those toxic chemicals used in cocaine production, they're polluting water sources, harming wildlife, poisoning the very ecosystems those communities depend on.
It's almost ironic. Cocaine is associated with wealth and glamour, yet its production relies on some of the most environmentally destructive practices imaginable.
It's a disconnect we can't ignore. Our demand for cocaine is directly contributing to an ecological crisis in the Amazon and beyond. And those smuggling routes we talked about, think about the fuel consumption, the waste generated, the potential for spills and accidents. It all adds up.
We've seen the impact on individuals, communities, the environment. But there's another layer to this crisis, too. Corruption. That YouTube deep dive on Clan del Golfo, it showed how they've infiltrated government agencies, law enforcement. It's a system that seems almost impossible to break.
It erodes trust in institutions. It creates a sense of hopelessness. When people see those in power profiting from this trade, it fuels further instability. It perpetuates the cycle of violence and poverty.
And it's not just a problem in producing countries either. Remember those smugglers Louis and Chanel met on the UK coast? They were bragging about how easy it is to bring cocaine into the country. They even implied that corrupt officials are facilitating the process. It's happening right under our noses.
It highlights the need for systemic change, both here and abroad. The war on drugs, as it's currently being waged, it isn't working. We need to address the root causes, the poverty, the lack of opportunity, the insatiable demand.
So what are the solutions? Is there any hope for breaking this cycle of destruction?
There are no easy answers, and I think our sources point to some key areas. For starters, we need to invest in sustainable development in coca-producing regions, give farmers like Pedro viable alternatives, empower communities, break the cycle of poverty that fuels this trade.
That's a long-term solution, though, right? What about more immediate action?
Well, there's growing momentum behind decriminalization and regulation here in the UK. The idea is to shift the focus from punishment to harm reduction, treating drug use as a public health issue rather than a criminal one.
That's a controversial topic for sure, but it's a conversation we need to have. The current system clearly isn't working. We have record levels of cocaine production and consumption, and the human and environmental costs are spiraling out of control.
It's about finding a more humane and effective approach. But change also starts with individual choices. We need to be more conscious of our own consumption, educate ourselves about the consequences, and support organizations working to make a difference.
So it's not just about policy change. It's about personal responsibility, too. We can choose to abstain from using cocaine, and if we do choose to use it, be mindful of where it comes from. Every decision we make has an impact.
Exactly. It's about understanding that we're all connected, and our choices, whether big or small, have the power to create ripples of change.
I love that. Ripples of change. Reminds us that we're not powerless, so what can we do? Are there specific organizations or resources you'd recommend our listeners check out if they want to learn more or get involved?
Absolutely. There are fantastic organizations working on the ground, like the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. They provide tons of information and data on the global drug trade. And for those interested in the environmental impact groups like the Amazon Conservation Team and Rainforest Alliance are doing incredible work to protect the rainforest and promote sustainable livelihoods.
Those are great resources. And for anyone struggling with addiction or who knows someone who is, the National Helpline for Drug and Alcohol Addiction offers confidential support and resources. It's important to remember that addiction is not a sign of weakness and recovery is possible.
You're absolutely right. Help is available, and there's no shame in reaching out. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the cocaine trade, what's one final thought-provoking question you'd like to leave our listener with?
Okay, hit me with it. What's the big question?
Knowing what you know now about the intricate network of the cocaine trade, the devastating human and environmental costs, the complex factors that contribute to its existence. If you were in a position of power, what would you do to address this issue? What changes would you make, and what solutions would you prioritize? It's a challenging question, but one that deserves careful consideration.
Wow, that's powerful. It forces us to move beyond being passive observers and to really think about what we can do to create a more just and equitable world.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all part of this system, and our choices, both big and small, have the power to make a difference.
That's an incredibly inspiring note to end on. So to our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a better understanding of the cocaine trade, its complexities, and its consequences.
Remember, knowledge is power. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better world.
And keep diving deep.
Yeah.
That's a question that could keep us talking for hours. But you're right, it's the perfect challenge to leave with our listener. I mean, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of this problem, right? But we all have a role to play in creating change.
Absolutely. And it starts with understanding the nuances, moving beyond those simplistic narratives we often hear about the drug trade.
Right. Because we've seen how intertwined this issue is with poverty, corruption, environmental destruction, personal choices. It's not a problem with a single solution. It's going to take a multifaceted approach.
Yeah, exactly. We need to address those systemic issues, empower communities, and promote sustainable development in those cocoa-growing regions.
And here in the UK, we need to have some honest conversations about drug policy, harm reduction, treatment.
We can support organizations working on the ground, advocate for change, and make conscious choices in our own lives.
Every little bit helps, right? Whether it's donating to a rainforest conservation group or just talking to friends and family about the true cost of cocaine.
Precisely. It's about raising awareness, breaking down those stigmas, and creating a more informed and compassionate society.
Well, I think we've given our listener a lot to chew on. This has been a truly eye-opening deep dive for me, I have to say.
Me too. It's a sobering reminder of how interconnected our world really is and the power of individual action.
So to our listener, if you've made it this far, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you've come away with a new perspective on the cocaine trade, its complexities and consequences.
Remember, knowledge is power. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.